The missing page from Lady Bantry's diary. A Miss Marple Mystery, Wexcombe, Somerset, 1952. Chapter 1. The Drowned Swan's Reflection. The fete at Wrexham Court had been, by every account that mattered, a tremendous success. The bunting strung between the cedar trees had not torn loose in the wind, the urn for tea had not run dry before 4 o'clock, and the vicar's wife had managed, against all previous record, to sell every last jar of her bottled damsons before the church clock struck 3. Lady Bantry herself had circulated among her guests in a wide straw hat, the colour of clotted cream, pressing small cakes upon children, and listening, with the particular patience of a woman who had spent 40 years being listened to herself, to the complaints of elderly farmers about the price of feed. It was Miss Marple who first noticed that something in the rhythm of the afternoon had gone wrong. She had been sitting in a folding chair near the rose pergola, ostensibly absorbed in the raffle programme, but in truth watching the small human dramas that unfolded wherever people gathered in numbers. The young curate's wife glancing too often toward the cricket pavilion, the baker's boy pocketing a coin that was not his, the way old Colonel Ashworth's hand trembled now when he lifted his cup, which it had not done the summer before. These small things interested Miss Marple far more than the raffle, though she had, out of politeness, bought 4 tickets. It was the swans that alerted her in the end. There were 2 of them on the ornamental lake below the terrace, a pair Lady Bantry had kept for some 11 years, and they had a habit, well known to everyone in the village, of gliding toward the little stone jetty whenever a human figure approached with anything resembling bread. At 4:30, the larger of the 2 birds began to call, not its usual imperious honk demanding tribute, but a thin, agitated cry that carried oddly across the lawn and silenced, for a moment, the brass band. "How strange," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular, and got up from her chair, rather more quickly than her 70-odd years generally allowed. By the time she reached the top of the terrace steps, a small crowd had already gathered at the water's edge, and the strange, terrible stillness of people who have just understood something they cannot yet say aloud had settled over them. Tobias Fenn, the gardener, was wading in up to his thighs, his good trousers ruined, hauling at something pale that floated face down near the reeds. It was Lady Bantry. They got her out, of course, and laid her on the grass, and Dr. Pelham came running from the croquet lawn with his collar undone and his face grey, and for a long while there was a great deal of useless activity, someone fetching a blanket that was not needed, someone else being violently sick behind the rhododendrons, the band, with the special tactlessness of brass instruments, finishing the floral dance before anyone thought to stop them. Miss Marple did not go close. She had learned, over the years, that there was very little a sharp-eyed elderly woman could usefully do beside a body that a doctor was already examining, and that the things worth observing were rarely found in the centre of a crowd. Instead, she stood a little apart, near the stone balustrade, and watched the faces of the people around her. She watched Rosamond Tate, Lady Bantry's companion, standing absolutely rigid, with one hand pressed to her mouth, tears running freely and silently down her face. And yet, Miss Marple thought, there was something in the woman's stillness that did not look quite like grief, or not only like grief. She watched Victor Ainsley, the family solicitor, who had arrived only that morning from Taunton on some business matter, go very white and then very carefully recover himself, smoothing his waistcoat with both hands as though that small, practical gesture might restore order to the afternoon. She watched the young woman who had been introduced to the village only a fortnight before as a distant cousin, Phyllis Carow, standing quite alone at the edge of the crowd, her expression unreadable. And she watched Lawrence Tully, Lady Bantry's newly discovered nephew, the orphaned son of her husband's late brother, who had arrived from Rhodesia the previous spring and had been, by all accounts, an absolute delight to the old lady in her final year, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the body with an expression that Miss Marple, who had seen a great many expressions on a great many faces over the years, found very difficult indeed to name. Dr. Pelham straightened up at last, wiping his hands on his handkerchief in a gesture that was somehow more final than anything he might have said aloud. "She's gone," he said. "Has been gone some little while, I should think. Someone had better fetch Drake." Inspector Colin Drake, when he arrived some 40 minutes later from the police house in the village, was a square, unhurried man, with the look of someone who had hoped, on a fine Saturday in June, to spend the afternoon weeding his vegetable marrows, rather than attending to the sudden death of the most prominent woman in the parish. He listened to Dr. Pelham's preliminary account. A blow to the back of the head, possibly from striking the stone edge of the jetty as she fell, water in the lungs consistent with drowning, no obvious sign of violence beyond the head wound, and nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man already constructing, in his mind, the shape of the report he would have to write. "Slipped on the wet stone, like as not," he said. "There's algae on that jetty thick as butter. I told her ladyship as much myself, 2 summers back, when young Tommy Pratt went arse over tip into the water chasing his dog." "It does seem the likeliest explanation," Dr. Pelham agreed, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the word likeliest. Miss Marple, standing nearby with her raffle programme still folded in one gloved hand, said nothing at all, but she had noticed as the small crowd shifted and murmured that Lady Bantry's left hand, when they laid her on the grass, had been closed very tightly around a single torn scrap of paper, and that Lawrence Tully's eyes had gone to that small fist of paper before they had gone anywhere else, before the tears, before the doctor, before anything. It was, she thought, a very small thing to notice. But then, in her experience, the very small things were so often the ones that mattered. She walked home that evening in the long golden light that comes only in June, past the War Memorial with its short, sober list of names, past the Wexcombe Arms where the landlord was already setting out chairs on the forecourt against the warm evening, past the churchyard where the new grass had grown thick and green over the older graves and rather thinner over the more recent ones. The village seemed, on the surface, entirely unchanged. The same dogs barked at her from the same gateways, the same lamps were being lit in the same cottage windows, and yet she was aware, with the particular clarity that came to her at such moments, that something fundamental had shifted in Wexcombe that afternoon, in the way that a single dropped stitch can alter the whole pattern of a piece of knitting without the change becoming visible for several rows yet to come. She thought of Lady Bantry as she had known her, not intimately, for their friendship had been the comfortable, slightly distant sort common among women of a certain age in a small community, built more on shared committees and shared memories of the village as it had once been than on any great exchange of personal confidence, but warmly nonetheless. She remembered Lady Bantry's loud, decisive laugh at parish council meetings, her genuine, if sometimes impatient generosity toward those she considered deserving of it, her fierce, old-fashioned loyalty to the idea of family, which had made the arrival of a long-lost nephew, after so many childless years, so very precious to her. It seemed a particularly cruel irony, Miss Marple reflected, that the thing Lady Bantry had wanted most in her final years might prove, in the end, to have had some bearing on the manner of her death, though it was, she reminded herself firmly, very much too early yet to draw any such conclusion with confidence. One must not, she thought, allow a single observed detail, a fist of torn paper, a swan's distressed cry, an expression on a young man's face that might mean a great deal, or might mean nothing whatsoever, to harden too quickly into a theory. That was the surest way to overlook the truth entirely, by deciding what it must be before one had properly finished looking. Chapter 2. Whispers over the teacups. By the following morning, the village of Wexcombe had arranged itself into roughly 4 schools of opinion regarding the death of Lady Bantry, and Miss Marple, calling at the post office to send a letter to her nephew Raymond, found herself in an excellent position to hear all four expounded within the space of 15 minutes. The first school, represented chiefly by Miriam Holt behind the post office counter, held that it was a simple and tragic accident, the sort of thing that happened to elderly ladies who would not give up feeding troublesome swans despite repeated warnings, and that the only mystery worth discussing was whether the council would finally agree to fence off the lake now that it had claimed a second victim in living memory. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Holt, weighing out stamps with the brisk authority of a woman who considered herself second only to the vicar in matters of local wisdom. "They'll have an inquest, and the inquest will say misadventure, and that will be the end of it. It's always the way with these things." The second school, advanced with considerable relish by old Mrs. Pargeter, who had come in for her pension and showed no inclination to leave before extracting every available crumb of gossip, suspected Tobias Fenn. Had he not, only the week before, been overheard quarrelling with her ladyship about his wages, loudly enough that the boot boy had heard it through the scullery window? Had he not moreover a temper? Was it not common knowledge that he had once, some years ago, been bound over for a fray after a disagreement outside the Wexcombe Arms that had ended with another man's nose broken? "A man like that," said Mrs. Pargeter darkly, "doesn't lose his temper just the once." The third school favoured a more romantic theory, and its chief proponent was the curate's young wife, who held, with the particular conviction of someone who read a great many detective novels from the lending library, that the death was connected to old family scandal, that there must be a will involved, and that the new nephew from Rhodesia was altogether too charming and too convenient to be entirely trusted. The fourth school, smaller than the others but not without its adherents, simply enjoyed the drama for its own sake and had no theory at all beyond a general agreement that it was most distressing, and that the fête would surely have to be cancelled next year out of respect, though privately several of its members had already begun planning what they would wear to the funeral. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the mild, slightly vague attentiveness of an elderly spinster who has nothing better to do than buy stamps, and contributed almost nothing beyond a few sympathetic murmurs. It was a technique that had served her very well over a great many years, in a great many village shops. It was only when she had collected her change and was turning to leave that Mrs. Holt, lowering her voice to the particular register reserved for the choicest gossip, added one further detail. "And they do say," said Mrs. Holt, "that her ladyship's diary's gone missing a page. Rosamond Tate found it this morning when she went to put the household accounts away. The ribbon marker right there, plain as you like, but the page itself torn clean out. Now, what do you make of that, Miss Marple?" "How very curious," said Miss Marple, and meant it rather more sincerely than her tone suggested. She walked home along the lane that ran beside the churchyard, taking her time, as she generally did, to observe the small details of the morning, the state of the Henderson's delphiniums, which had clearly been savaged by slugs, the fact that the milkman's cart had left 2 bottles at the empty cottage that had stood vacant since old Mr. Trubshaw's death, suggesting either an error or a new tenant not yet known to the village grapevine. The unusual sight of Lawrence Tully's motor car, a rather flashy green roadster quite unsuited to English lanes, parked outside the solicitor's office in the High Street at an hour when Mr. Ainsley's office was not generally known to be open. She filed each of these observations away, as was her habit, without yet attaching any particular significance to them. It was far too early, she reflected, to know which details would matter, and which would turn out to be nothing more than the ordinary, harmless untidiness of village life. But a missing page from a diary, on the very day its keeper had died, that, she thought, was not the sort of detail one filed away and forgot. That afternoon she called at Wraxham Court, ostensibly to leave a small bunch of sweet peas from her own garden and to offer her condolences to the household, and found Rosamond Tate in the morning room, white-faced and red-eyed, attempting with visibly trembling hands to compose a list of those who must be notified of the death. "It's so very kind of you, Miss Marple," said the younger woman, accepting the flowers with the distracted gratitude of someone whose mind was very much elsewhere. "I scarcely know what to do with myself. There is so much to arrange, and Mr. Ainsley says the will must be read before anything can be settled, and I—" She stopped and pressed her handkerchief briefly to her mouth. "You mustn't try to do everything at once, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, settling herself into the window seat with the air of a woman who intended to stay rather longer than a simple condolence call usually required. I do hope you won't think it impertinent of me to ask, but I heard the most extraordinary thing in the village this morning, something about a page missing from dear Lady Bantry's diary." Rosamond's hand stilled on the notepaper. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I found it myself this morning when I went to lock the desk. There's a ribbon she always kept in the page she was currently using, to mark her place, you understand, for she wrote in it every single evening, without fail, for as long as I've known her, and the ribbon was there, exactly where it should be, but the page itself had been cut out, quite cleanly, with a knife or a razor, not torn." "How very strange," said Miss Marple. "And do you know what she might have written there? On that particular page, I mean." "I haven't the least idea," said Rosamond, and there was something in the quickness of her answer, Miss Marple thought, that suggested either complete honesty or a very well-rehearsed lie, though which of the two it was as yet impossible to say. Miss Marple did not press the point further just then. Instead, she allowed her gaze to travel about the study itself, the heavy mahogany desk, the rows of estate ledgers bound in matching calf, the small silver-framed photograph of Lady Bantry's late husband that stood upon the mantelpiece, his moustache magnificent, his expression faintly disapproving of the whole modern world, as so many photographs of deceased husbands seem to be. It was, she thought, an ordinary room, made extraordinary only by the small, deliberate absence within it, a missing page no larger than her own gloved hand, and yet, she suspected, quite large enough to have changed the entire course of an old woman's final days. "Tell me, Rosamond," she said at last, "did Lady Bantry seem at all troubled, in these last weeks, by anything beyond the ordinary business of the will and the new arrangements for Mr. Tully? I do not mean troubled in any obvious way. I mean only the small, private sort of unease that a person sometimes carries about with them, without ever quite naming it to anyone else." Rosamond considered this for a long moment, smoothing the blotting paper on the desk with unnecessary care. She had taken to walking alone in the evenings, she said at last, more than she used to, down by the lake generally, after dinner, when the light was going. I asked her once whether she oughtn't to take a stick, the path being uneven in places, and she said she found the walking helped her to think, and that there were things she needed to think through properly before she spoke to anyone else about them. I didn't ask what things. It wasn't my place to ask, and besides, I assumed it was something to do with the will. Perhaps it was, said Miss Marple, or perhaps it was something rather different. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Tidy Solution. Inspector Drake was not, by temperament, a man who enjoyed complexity. He had spent 11 years policing Wexcombe and the surrounding villages, and in that time the most serious crimes he had been called upon to investigate were a spate of hen thefts in 1949 and an incident involving a stolen bicycle that had turned out, upon inquiry, not to have been stolen at all, but merely borrowed without sufficient notice. He approached the death of Lady Bantry, therefore, with the sincere hope that it would resolve itself along similarly modest lines, and Dr. Pelham's report, while it left him a shade uneasy, gave him just enough room to hope so. "The blow to the head is consistent with a fall against the stone jetty," Dr. Pelham had written, with the careful hedging of a country doctor who knew his limitations, though I would note that the angle and position of the wound are not, in my judgment, entirely typical of such a fall. I should recommend a more thorough post-mortem examination before any conclusion is reached. Drake read this twice, sighed, and decided that a coroner's inquest, conducted with appropriate gravity, would settle the matter one way or another, and that in the meantime there was no harm in making a few preliminary inquiries, chiefly, he told himself, so that he could report to his superiors that he had been thorough. His preliminary inquiries led him, with a directness that Miss Marple privately considered rather too convenient, straight to Tobias Fenn. It was not difficult to see why. Fenn had quarrelled openly with Lady Bantry the week before, over wages he considered insufficient for the work of maintaining 4 acres of garden, virtually single-handed since the death of the under-gardener old Pegram the previous winter. He had been seen near the lake only minutes before the body was discovered, ostensibly checking the punt for the children's rides that had been promised as part of the Fates entertainment. He had, moreover, a police record, 8 years old now, but still on file, for the affray outside the Wexcombe Arms, a fact that Inspector Drake regarded, not unreasonably from his own point of view, as relevant. "He's a man with a temper," Drake told his sergeant, a young constable named Hobbs who had joined the force only the previous autumn, and still regarded the inspector's pronouncements with something close to reverence. "A man with a grudge, a man who was on the spot. I don't say it's proved, mind, not by a long chalk, but it's the sort of thing a coroner likes to see laid out plain." It was therefore with some surprise that Inspector Drake, calling at Miss Marple's cottage 2 days after the death, ostensibly to ask whether she had noticed anything unusual from her vantage point near the Rose pergola, since it was well known in the village that little escaped Miss Marple's attention, even when she appeared to be absorbed in a raffle programme, found the old lady disinclined to share his confidence in the gardener's guilt. "Oh, I shouldn't think it was Tobias Fenn at all," said Miss Marple, pouring out tea with the unhurried precision of a woman for whom the ritual of tea-pouring was itself a kind of thinking. "He has a temper, certainly, and he is not always careful with his words. I believe he called Mr. Hobbs's predecessor a name in the Wexcombe Arms that the magistrate found quite unsuitable for repetition in court. But a man who shouts when he is angry, Inspector, is very rarely the same sort of man who plans something quietly and carries it out without a single witness. It has been my experience that the loud ones are generally telling you exactly what they feel, which is its own kind of honesty, however inconvenient. It is the quiet ones, the ones who smile and say nothing at all, that one ought to watch." Inspector Drake, who privately considered this the sort of remark elderly ladies were fond of making without any real evidence to support it, nonetheless wrote it down in his notebook, partly out of politeness and partly because he had learned, over the years, that Miss Marple's vague-sounding observations had an irritating tendency to prove correct. "Be that as it may," he said, "Fenn had motive, and he had opportunity, and there's precious little else pointing anywhere in particular, unless you've something more specific to offer me, Miss Marple." "I do find myself wondering," said Miss Marple, "about the missing page from Lady Bantry's diary." "The companion mentioned that," said Drake, not troubling to hide his lack of enthusiasm. "Could be anything. Old ladies tear pages out of diaries all the time. Write something they regret, think better of it the next morning. Doesn't signify much to my mind." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "And yet it does seem a curious coincidence that she should choose to remove a page on the very day she came to her death, for Rosamond tells me the ribbon marker was in the most recent page, which means it was very likely written either that morning or the evening before. I wonder, Inspector, whether you might be persuaded to ask Mr. Ainsley what business brought him to Wrexham Court that particular weekend. I understand he does not generally call so far from Taunton without some specific matter to attend to." Drake regarded her for a long moment, the particular look of a practical man, trying to decide whether he is being led somewhere useful or merely somewhere time-consuming. "I'll ask him," he said at last, with the air of a man making a concession he expected to regret. "Though I'll tell you plainly, Miss Marple, my money's still on Fenn." "I'm sure it is, Inspector," said Miss Marple placidly, and offered him another scone. Chapter 4. A Page Gone Missing. Miss Marple, who had a great many small habits that her acquaintances found either charming or maddening depending on their patience, made a point of calling at Wraxham Court again the following afternoon, ostensibly to inquire whether Rosamond Tate required any assistance with the arrangements for the funeral, which had been set for the following week pending the coroner's findings. She found the household in a state of muted disarray. Mr. Ainsley had returned from Taunton, this time openly, to begin the slow business of sorting Lady Bantry's papers in advance of the reading of the will, and had established himself in the late lady's study with an air of brisk professional sorrow that Miss Marple found, on the whole, rather more convincing than most of the grief on display in the house that week. Lawrence Tully was nowhere to be seen, having gone, Rosamond explained, to see about arrangements at the church. Phyllis Carrow sat in the morning-room with a piece of needlework she did not appear to be making any actual progress on, and looked up at Miss Marple's entrance with an expression of polite, careful blankness. "Might I see the diary?" Miss Marple asked Rosamond, when the two of them were alone for a moment in the hall. "I do hope you won't think it morbid curiosity. It is only that I have always been rather interested in diaries, the way they capture a person's voice, you know, long after they themselves have gone. I should so like to read a little of dear Lady Bantry's, if you think she would not have minded. It was perhaps not entirely true, or rather, it was true as far as it went, but it did not go nearly so far as Miss Marple's real interest in the matter." Rosamond hesitated only a moment before leading her to the study, where the diary, a heavy volume bound in dark green leather with the year, tooled in gilt upon the spine, sat upon the desk beside a stack of correspondence that Mr. Ainsley had not yet found time to address. The missing page was easy enough to find. The ribbon marker, a faded strip of blue silk that had clearly seen years of service, lay between two leaves near the very end of the volume, and where the next page ought to have been, there was instead only a narrow strip of paper still caught in the binding, cut with a precision that spoke of a sharp blade and a careful hand, rather than any sudden fit of temper. "You see," said Rosamond, "it's not torn at all. It's been cut, quite neatly." "Yes," said Miss Marple, examining the binding with interest. "I do see that. A torn page, you know, suggests haste, or anger, or distress, someone tearing at something in a moment of strong feeling. But a cut page suggests something rather different. It suggests someone with the time and the steadiness of hand to find a blade and use it carefully. That is a very different sort of person, Rosamond, from someone tearing a page out in a temper." She turned back a few pages, reading, with Rosamond's somewhat reluctant permission, the entries immediately preceding the missing one. They were, for the most part, exactly what one might expect. Brief, business-like notes about the weather, about household matters, about the preparations for the fête, about a letter received from an old school friend in Bath. But two entries caught Miss Marple's attention particularly. The first, dated some 10 days before the death, read simply, "L. Came to tea again today. Such a comfort to have him here at last, though I confess there are moments when something he says puts me oddly in mind of poor Arthur, which is foolish of me, since they never met, Arthur having died so long before L was even born. Old age makes one fanciful, I dare say." The second, dated the evening before the fête, read, "Looked out the old photograph album tonight, the one from the Rhodesia years, to find the picture of dear Arthur's brother, that I might show L. Strange that I could not find it anywhere, though I am certain it was there as recently as last spring. I must ask R. whether she has moved my things again. I shall look properly in the morning, when my eyes are less tired." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple softly, more to herself than to Rosamond. "A missing photograph, and now a missing page. I do wonder, my dear, whether dear Lady Bantry ever did find that photograph in the morning." Rosamond's face, when Miss Marple looked up, had gone quite pale. "I never moved anything," she said, with a sudden, sharp urgency that surprised them both. "I want you to know that, Miss Marple. Whatever anyone says about me, I never touched her ladyship's things without asking. Not once. Not in 4 years." "I am quite sure you didn't, my dear," said Miss Marple, and patted the younger woman's hand with genuine kindness. But privately, she found herself wondering very much why Rosamond Tate should feel the need to protest her innocence on so small a matter, quite so vehemently, before anyone had thought to accuse her of anything at all. Chapter 5. The Companion's Trembling Hands. It was not until 3 days later, when Inspector Drake, somewhat against his own inclination, but mindful of Miss Marple's earlier remarks, undertook to interview each member of the household in turn, that the full measure of Rosamond Tate's distress became apparent. She had been Lady Bantry's companion for just over 4 years, having come to Wraxham Court after the death of her own mother left her, at 31, with neither family nor income, nor any very clear notion of what to do with herself. Lady Bantry, who had a habit of taking in lonely young women and putting them to gentle, useful work, had advertised for a companion through an agency in London, and Rosamond, who had answered the advertisement chiefly out of desperation, had found, to her own considerable surprise, that she was rather good at the work, and that she had grown, over the years, genuinely fond of the sharp-tongued, generous old woman who employed her. "I owed her everything," she told Inspector Drake, sitting very upright in the small sitting-room that had been hers since she came to the house, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white. "Everything. I cannot imagine why anyone would think—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "No one's accusing you of anything, Miss Tate," said Drake, not entirely truthfully, since he had in fact begun to wonder, prompted by certain remarks of Miss Marple's, that he was reluctant to admit had influenced him. "I'm simply trying to build up a picture of her ladyship's last days. You'd know better than anyone, I should think, whether anything was troubling her." Rosamond hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain in the room on the somewhat flimsy pretext of having brought Rosamond a basket of early raspberries from her own garden, and who sat now quietly in the corner with her knitting, saw something she recognized very well, the particular stillness of a person deciding how much of the truth to tell. "She had seemed distracted this last fortnight," Rosamond said at last. "Preoccupied. I put it down to the excitement of having Mr. Tully here and the business of the will being redrawn to provide for him. But there were moments when I caught her looking at him in a way I couldn't quite account for. Not unkindly, just thoughtfully, as though she were trying to remember something." "And did she ever say what it was she was trying to remember?" "No," said Rosamond, "though she did ask me, the day before the fête, whether I thought it possible for a person to change so much in 20 years that even their own family mightn't recognize them straight off. I said I supposed it was, people do change a great deal, and she said—" Rosamond stopped again, frowning with the effort of recollection. "She said, 'Yes, but not their voice, Rosamond. A voice doesn't change, not really, not underneath.' And then she laughed, and said she was being a foolish old woman, and we spoke no more of it." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been moving at their usual steady, unhurried pace, paused for the briefest of moments. "That is a very interesting thing for her to have said," she observed, when Inspector Drake glanced toward her, evidently expecting some comment. "A voice doesn't change. I wonder what put such a notion into her head." Drake, who found Miss Marple's interjections at once useful and faintly irritating, made a note in his book and pressed on. "And what of your own movements, on the afternoon of the fête, Miss Tate? Just for the record." It was here that Rosamond's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, but in the small, telling way that Miss Marple had seen so often in people unused to deception and unequal to it, a flush rising up her neck, her eyes dropping to her hands, a too quick, too careful recitation of an account that had clearly been rehearsed. "I was at the cake stall until 3:30, she said. Then I went to fetch more change from the house, since we'd run short, and I was gone, perhaps 20 minutes, no more. I came straight back to the stall. 20 minutes is rather a long time to fetch change, said Drake mildly. I couldn't find the cash box at first, said Rosamond. It had been moved from where it usually sits. It was, Miss Marple thought, watching the younger woman's hands twist in her lap, a perfectly reasonable explanation, and yet there was something in the careful flatness of its delivery that made her wonder whether it was the whole truth or only the part of it that Rosamond Tate had decided, for reasons of her own, was safe to share. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Locked Drawer. Victor Ainsley had been the Bantry family's solicitor for almost 20 years, inheriting the position, along with the firm itself, from his late father, and he carried about him the particular brand of polished discretion common to men whose profession requires them to know everyone's secrets and disclose none of them. He was a tall, spare man in his late 50s, with the slightly stooped bearing of someone who had spent a great many years bending over documents, and a manner so smoothly courteous that Miss Marple, on first acquaintance some years before, had privately thought him the sort of man one would trust absolutely with one's money, and not at all with one's confidences. He received Inspector Drake in Lady Bantry's study with every appearance of cooperation, answering questions about the estate, the will, and his own movements on the day of the fête with a fluency that suggested either complete innocence or very considerable practice. I came down from Taunton on the Friday, he said, to go over certain amendments her ladyship wished to make to her will, in light of Mr. Tully's arrival in the family. It is not, I should say, an unusual thing for a solicitor to attend to such matters in person rather than by letter, particularly where a substantial estate is concerned. And what were these amendments precisely? Drake asked. Ainsley's smooth courtesy did not waver, but there was the smallest of pauses before he answered. Her ladyship wished to provide for Mr. Tully as her late husband's nephew, and, in the absence of any closer kin, her presumptive heir. The bulk of the estate, Wraxham Court itself, and the income from the home farm was to pass to him, with certain provisions made for Miss Tate and for the household staff. It was, if I may say so, a generous and entirely reasonable arrangement. Had the new will been signed? Not yet, said Ainsley. Her ladyship wished to make one further alteration before signing, a small bequest to the Church Restoration Fund that she had forgotten to include, and we had arranged that I should return with the final document within the fortnight. As things stand, the previous will remains in force, which leaves the matter rather more complicated than it might otherwise have been. More complicated how? The previous will, said Ainsley, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words, divides the estate rather differently. A life interest in the house to Miss Tate, certain legacies to local charities, and the residue to be sold, and the proceeds distributed among several of her ladyship's late husband's more distant connections. Mr. Tully, I should say, features hardly at all in it, since of course he had not yet been discovered when that will was drawn up 3 years ago. It was Miss Marple, sitting once again in her unobtrusive corner with her knitting, who asked the next question in a tone of such mild and apparently innocent curiosity that Ainsley did not appear to register it as anything more than an old woman's idle interest. How was Mr. Tully discovered, Mr. Ainsley? I have heard the story told several ways in the village, and I confess I am not entirely sure which version is correct. Ainsley turned to her with the particular condescension some professional men reserve for elderly ladies they consider harmless. It is a rather affecting story, Miss Marple. Lady Bantry's husband, Colonel Bantry, forgive me, I should say her late husband had a younger brother, Edward, who emigrated to Rhodesia as a young man and was largely estranged from the family thereafter, owing to some old quarrel about money that I never fully understood. Edward married out there and had one son, but died himself some years before the war, and contact with that branch of the family was lost almost entirely. It was only last year, When Mr. Tully, having heard, through old family papers left by his late father, of his English relations, wrote to Lady Bantry on the chance that some connection might still exist, that the family was, so to speak, reunited. "How very romantic," said Miss Marple. "And he was able to prove the connection satisfactorily, I suppose? It must have required a great deal of documentation after so many years." "There were certain papers," said Ainsley, "letters of his late father's, a marriage certificate, that sort of thing. I examined them myself as a matter of professional caution and found nothing inconsistent with his claim. Lady Bantry herself, of course, required very little persuading. She had longed for family of her own blood about her for years, her own marriage having been childless, and Mr. Tully's manner and bearing struck her, from their very first meeting, as entirely consistent with what one might expect of Edward's son. And did she never think to write to anyone in Rhodesia to confirm the story independently? Ainsley's smooth composure flickered, very briefly, before resettling itself. "I believe she considered it unnecessary, Miss Marple. The documentary evidence appeared entirely satisfactory, and one does not, after all, generally write to strangers in another hemisphere to confirm the bona fides of one's own nephew." "No," agreed Miss Marple placidly. "I don't suppose one does." It was only after Ainsley had gone, and Inspector Drake had departed with him, that Miss Marple, left briefly alone in the study while Rosamond fetched fresh tea, permitted herself a small, private frown, and reached out to touch, very lightly, the worn green leather of Lady Bantry's diary, still sitting where it had been left upon the desk, its cut page a narrow, eloquent absence among so many full and unremarkable ones. Chapter 7. The Nephew Who Came Home. Lawrence Tully was, by any reasonable measure, an extremely charming man, and it was perhaps this very charm that had made him, in the space of little more than a year, almost universally popular in a village not generally inclined to embrace strangers with any great speed. He had a way of remembering small details about people, a sick child's name, the date of an anniversary, the precise nature of a neighbour's complaint about her hens, that made each person he spoke to feel singularly attended to, and he told stories of his life in Rhodesia, of farming and hunting and the vast unfamiliar landscape of his childhood, with a warmth and self-deprecating humour that disarmed even the village's more naturally suspicious elders. Miss Marple, who had met him on perhaps half a dozen occasions over the previous year, found herself, on each occasion, both charmed and faintly troubled in roughly equal measure, though it had taken her some while to identify quite why. She called upon him directly 3 days after the discovery of Lady Bantry's body, ostensibly to express her condolences in person, since she had not yet had the opportunity, and found him in the small library that had been his particular retreat since coming to Wrexham Court, sorting through a box of old family photographs with an expression of careful, performed grief that Miss Marple found, on close observation, just slightly too careful to be entirely convincing. "It's been a terrible shock, Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her with every appearance of warmth. "I'd only just begun to know her properly, to feel I really belonged here, you understand, after so many years of having no family at all to speak of. And now she's gone, just like that. It hardly seems real." "It must be a very particular kind of grief," said Miss Marple gently, settling herself into the chair he offered, "to lose someone just as you were beginning to know them. I have always thought that sort of loss carries its own special sorrow, all the conversations you imagined having that will now never take place." "Yes," said Tully, and something in his face, for just a moment, seemed to Miss Marple genuinely troubled, though whether by grief or by some other feeling entirely, she could not yet say. "Yes, exactly that." "Tell me about your father," said Miss Marple, with the air of a woman making polite conversation rather than conducting an investigation. "Lady Bantry's husband's brother, was he not? I never met the gentleman myself, of course, but I understand he left England a very long time ago." "Before I was born," said Tully easily. He never spoke a great deal about his life here. There was some old quarrel with the family, money trouble, I believe, though he never gave me the particulars. He died when I was 12, out on the farm, a fever of some kind that the doctors out there couldn't properly treat. I scarcely remember him, if I'm honest. It was only after my own father's—" He paused and corrected himself smoothly. "After his papers came to me some years later, that I found the old letters and thought to write to Lady Bantry, on the chance that some connection might still exist." "How fortunate that you did," said Miss Marple. "And how fortunate, too, that you should have found such a welcome here. I understand Lady Bantry was quite captivated by you from the very first." "She was very kind to me," said Tully, and for the first time something in his easy fluency seemed to falter very slightly, as though he had, for a moment, lost the thread of a story he had told so many times that the telling of it had become almost automatic. "Kinder than I had any right to expect, given that I came to her as a complete stranger." Miss Marple's gaze drifted, with apparent idleness, to the box of photographs on the table between them. Old, faded prints of a vanished colonial world, men in pith helmets standing beside motor cars, women in white dresses on shaded verandas, and settled, after a moment, on one particular photograph that Tully had set slightly apart from the others. "What a charming picture," she said. "Is that your father, as a young man?" Tully glanced at the photograph, a faded image of two young men standing together before what appeared to be a colonial farmhouse, both fair-haired, both smiling. And there was, Miss Marple thought, the very smallest hesitation before he answered. "Yes," he said, "that's him, on the left." "He has rather a distinctive look about him," said Miss Marple, peering at the photograph with the mild, unthreatening curiosity of an old woman interested in family resemblances. "I should have thought you took after your mother's side myself. You don't look terribly much like him, do you?" "So everyone tells me," said Tully, with a laugh that came, Miss Marple thought, just a fraction of a second too quickly to be entirely natural. "My mother always said I was the very image of her own father. It's rather a family joke." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple, and smiled, and said nothing further on the subject, though she noted with the quiet, unhurried attention she brought to such small things, that Lawrence Tully's hand, when he returned the photograph to the box, was not quite steady. Chapter 8. Roses That Don't Belong. It was 3 days later, while walking in the rose garden at Wraxham Court with Phyllis Carow, who had, somewhat to Miss Marple's surprise, sought her out and asked, with evident anxiety, whether they might speak privately, that Miss Marple made the small observation that would, in time, prove to matter rather more than anyone in Wexcombe could then have guessed. Phyllis was a quiet, watchful young woman of perhaps 26, who had arrived in the village only a fortnight before the fête, introduced by Lawrence Tully as a connection of his mother's family, distantly related and currently without a settled home, whom he had invited to stay at Wraxham Court while she considered her future. She had said very little at the fête itself, and less since, and Miss Marple had formed the impression, correctly as it turned out, that the young woman was a great deal more frightened than her composed exterior suggested. "I don't know who else to speak to," Phyllis said now, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers as they walked among the rose beds, the late afternoon sun catching the deep red of the climbing roses that covered the south wall. "Everyone says such terrible things in the village, that it must have been Mr. Fenn, or that there's some scandal about the will, and I keep thinking, Miss Marple, that I ought to say something, only I don't quite know what it is I would be saying, or whether it matters at all." "Why don't you tell me?" said Miss Marple gently, "and we shall decide together whether it matters." Phyllis was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the rose bed beside them. A bed of pale, old-fashioned damask roses, heavily scented, quite different from the more modern hybrid teas that grew along the terrace above. "Lawrence isn't quite what he says he is," she said at last, very low. "I don't mean I don't think he's done anything wrong exactly. Only, he isn't really my cousin, Miss Marple. We met in Cape Town, on the boat over, and he was kind to me. And when he found I had nowhere particular to go and very little money, he suggested I come and stay here a while and present myself as a relation, since it would look better for both of us than the truth, which is rather more ordinary and rather less respectable. And what is the truth, my dear? That I was engaged to be married, in Cape Town, to a man who turned out to be already married to someone else, and I left rather suddenly and in some disgrace, and Lawrence, who knew the family slightly, from some previous dealing, offered to help me get away and start again, somewhere no one knew the story. Phyllis looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He's been good to me, Miss Marple, in his own way, but I don't know that I trust him, not entirely, and after what's happened to Lady Bantry, I find myself wondering all sorts of things I'd rather not wonder. Such as? Such as where he really comes from, said Phyllis. He told me, on the boat, that he'd grown up on a farm outside Bulawayo, but I grew up not 40 miles from there myself, and when I mentioned a particular kind of flower that grows wild all through that district in the spring, flame lilies we call them, great drifts of them along the kopjes, he hadn't the least idea what I meant. Said he'd never seen such a thing in his life. I thought it odd at the time, but put it down to a poor memory for plants. I've thought of it rather differently since. Miss Marple, who had been examining the damask roses with apparent absorption, looked up at this with an expression of mild, focused interest that those who knew her well would have recognized as considerably more significant than it appeared. A man who grew up on a farm in that part of the world, she said slowly, and had never seen a flame lily in flower. That is, I think, rather more than a poor memory for plants, my dear. That is the sort of detail a person can really only get wrong if they were never there to begin with. Chapter 9. The Vicar's Old Grudge. The Reverend Owen Bryce had been Vicar of Wexcombe for some 14 years, and in that time had developed what his parishioners regarded, with varying degrees of affection and exasperation, as an almost obsessive devotion to the restoration of the church tower, which had been declared unsafe by a surveyor in 1947, and had remained so, owing chiefly to a persistent shortage of funds, ever since. It was widely known in the village that he had asked Lady Bantry, on more than one occasion, for a substantial donation toward the Restoration Fund, and widely known also that she had, with her customary directness, declined. She told me, he confided to Miss Marple when she called at the vicarage to discuss the funeral arrangements, that she had quite enough calls upon her purse already, and that in her opinion a tower that had stood since the 14th century was unlikely to fall down in the next 10 years merely to spite a surveyor's report. I confess I found her attitude rather trying, at times, though I should say at once, Miss Marple, that I bore her not the slightest ill will. One does not murder a parishioner over a matter of church repairs, whatever the village gossips may be saying. I'm sure no one suspects anything of the kind, Mr. Bryce, said Miss Marple, though in fact she had heard precisely such a suggestion advanced, with considerable confidence, by Mrs. Pargeter only the previous afternoon. Though I do understand you called at Wraxham Court rather frequently this past month. I did, said the vicar, with the slightly defensive air of a man who suspects, not without reason, that his movements have been the subject of unflattering speculation. She had told me, only a week or two before her death, that she was reconsidering her position regarding the fund, that she had been thinking about the matter of her legacy, and wished to discuss with me what provision might be made in her will. I had hoped, I will admit this freely, since I am sure it will come out regardless, that her new nephew's arrival, and the consequent revision of her will, might leave room for a more generous settlement upon the church than her previous arrangements had allowed. And did it? I don't know, said the vicar simply. The new will was never signed. Whatever provision she intended to make, it has died with her, unless Mr. Ainsley can find some indication of her wishes among her private papers." He sighed and looked, for a moment, genuinely sorrowful, though whether for the loss of Lady Bantry or the loss of the church tower's prospects, Miss Marple found it difficult to say with any certainty. "I shall have to begin the appeals all over again, I expect. It is a depressing thought, on top of everything else." Miss Marple found herself, on the whole, disposed to believe the vicar entirely innocent of anything beyond a certain ecclesiastical self-interest that was, in her experience, almost universal among clergymen charged with the upkeep of medieval buildings, and she said as much, gently, to Inspector Drake when he called at her cottage that evening to report on the progress of his inquiries. "He hasn't the nerve for it in any case," she said, setting down her teacup. "A man who screws up his courage to ask a rich old woman for money, and is refused, and asks again, and is refused again. That is not, in my experience, the temperament of a murderer. Murderers of the more deliberate sort, Inspector, tend to be people who do not ask. They simply take, or arrange matters so that taking becomes unnecessary." "That's all very well," said Drake, "but it doesn't get me any further forward, does it? I've now got Fen with motive and opportunity, the companion behaving oddly and lying about her movements, the solicitor with a will not yet signed that would have left him out of pocket either way it went, and a vicar who wanted money he never got. Half the village had some reason or other to wish her ladyship ill, and not one of them adds up to a case I could take to a coroner with any confidence." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "though I do think, Inspector, that you are perhaps looking at rather too many people, and not quite closely enough at the one detail that connects them all." "And what detail might that be?" "The missing page," said Miss Marple, "and the missing photograph. Someone, Inspector, went to a great deal of trouble to remove 2 small pieces of paper from Lady Bantry's possession in the days before her death. One cut neatly from a diary, the other simply vanished from an album she had not consulted in some months. I think that whoever did so was very anxious indeed that Lady Bantry should not look at either of those 2 things too closely, just at this particular time. And I think, moreover, that it is no accident that both should concern themselves with the same subject." "Which is Mr. Tully's identity," said Miss Marple, "and whether it is quite what it claims to be." Chapter 10. A Birthmark Remembered. It was old Colonel Ashworth, encountered quite by chance at the lending library where Miss Marple had gone to return a novel and select another, who provided the detail that would, in time, prove decisive, though neither he nor Miss Marple recognised its full significance at the moment it was offered. The Colonel was 81, increasingly deaf, and possessed of the long, undimmed memory for the distant past that so often accompanies advancing age, even as the events of the previous week grow correspondingly hazy. He had served as a much younger man in Rhodesia himself, in the years just before the First War, and had known, though only slightly he was careful to specify, the Bantry family's Rhodesian connections. "Knew Edward Bantry a little, out there," he told Miss Marple, settling into the conversation with the evident pleasure of a man who finds, increasingly rarely these days, someone willing to listen to his recollections at length. "Difficult fellow. Quarrelled with everyone, as I recall, including his own brother back home. That was the trouble that sent him out there in the first place. Some row about money that I never had the full particulars of. Married a Dutch girl from one of the farming families near Bulawayo. Had one son, far as I know. Lost touch with him after I came home in 1913, of course. Heard he died some years later. Fever, I believe, though I couldn't swear to the details." "Did you ever meet the son?" Miss Marple asked, with the appearance of only mild interest. "Once, as I recall," said the Colonel. "Small boy at the time, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. Came to a New Year's gathering with his parents at the club in Bulawayo. Odd little fellow, very quiet, hardly said a word the whole evening, but I remember him chiefly because of the mark on his arm. Curious thing, like a small reddish stain just below the left elbow, the sort of birthmark some children have. His mother made rather a fuss of it, I recall. Said it was a family mark, passed down on her own side for 3 generations, and that her own father had borne the very same one in the very same place. Miss Marple's hands, occupied in selecting a novel from the lending shelf, went very still. "How extraordinary that you should remember such a small detail, after so many years," she said. "Well, you remember the oddest things at my age," said the Colonel, with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I can see that boy's face plain as anything, and his mother's fussing over that mark on his arm. Funny how the mind works." "Indeed it is," said Miss Marple, and selected her novel, and bid the Colonel a pleasant good afternoon, and walked home along the lane with the particular brisk, purposeful tread that those who knew her well would have recognized as the outward sign of an inward conviction rapidly hardening into certainty. For she had, only the previous week, shaken hands with Lawrence Tully on no fewer than 2 occasions, and had noted, without at the time attaching any significance to the observation, that his left forearm, visible briefly when he rolled back his shirt-sleeve to assist Mr. Fenn with a fallen branch in the drive, bore no mark of any kind at all, reddish or otherwise, anywhere near the elbow, or indeed anywhere along its length. It was, she reflected, the sort of small physical detail that a man might easily forge a document to obscure, or a relative's faded memory to overlook, but that no amount of charm, no quantity of carefully memorized family stories could entirely conjure into existence where nature had simply failed to place it. Chapter 11. The Ash in the Grate. It was Tobias Fenn, of all people, who provided Miss Marple with her next piece of evidence, though he did so quite unwittingly, and in the course of a conversation that began as nothing more than an attempt on his part to clear his own name. He came to her cottage on a wet Thursday evening, hat in hand, clearly uncomfortable at finding himself there at all, and explained, with the gruff awkwardness of a man unused to asking favours, that he had heard she was the sort of person the inspector listened to, and that he wondered whether she might be persuaded to put in a word on his behalf, since half the village had already convicted him in their own minds, and he could see no way of proving his innocence beyond simply continuing to assert it. "I never touched her, Miss Marple," he said, turning his cap round and round in his big, weathered hands. "We quarrelled about wages, true enough, and I'll not pretend otherwise, but quarrelling's not killing, whatever Mrs. Pargeter would have the whole village believe. I was down checking the punt that afternoon, same as I told the inspector, and I never went near the jetty itself until I heard the swans set up their noise and came running same as everyone else." "I believe you, Mr. Fenn," said Miss Marple, and was gratified to see the visible relief this small statement produced in him. "Tell me, in the course of your work about the grounds, do you ever have occasion to clear the ash from the grates in the house itself, or is that a task left entirely to the indoor staff?" Fenn looked faintly puzzled by the apparent change of subject, but answered readily enough. "I do the library grate myself, most mornings, since the housemaid's afraid of the dog that sleeps by it and won't go in till it's let out. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? Did you happen to clear that grate on the morning after the fête, the morning Lady Bantry's body was found, I mean?" "I did," said Fenn, "though it's a queer thing you should ask. Now I think on it, there was more ash than usual, and a few scraps not properly burnt, bits of paper, charred at the edges but not gone right through. I didn't think much of it at the time. People burn all sorts of things in a grate. But I did notice, because it's unusual for the family to light a fire in June at all, even on a cool evening, and that one had clearly burned right down to nothing before I cleared it, which meant someone had lit it good and proper the night before, or very early that morning. Do you still have any of those scraps, Mr. Fenn, or did you simply sweep them away with the rest of the ash?" "Swept away, I'm afraid," said Fenn, looking apologetic, as though he had failed some test he had not known he was sitting. "Went straight onto the kitchen garden, same as always. Good for the soil, ash is. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, if it's important. I'd no notion at the time that it might matter to anything." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "There was no reason you should have thought so. But I am very glad indeed that you mentioned it to me now, Mr. Fenn, and I think you need not trouble yourself any further about Inspector Drake's suspicions. I believe matters will resolve themselves a good deal sooner than you fear." When Fenn had gone, considerably comforted, Miss Marple sat for a long while by her own small fire, turning the new information over in her mind, with the careful, unhurried attention she brought to every piece of a puzzle, however small. A fire lit in the library grate on a warm June evening when no fire was needed for warmth at all. That, she thought, was the sort of detail that made excellent sense if a person required, urgently and without delay, some means of destroying a single sheet of paper too thoroughly to leave any readable trace. And the library, she recalled, was the room in which Lawrence Tully had been sitting, surrounded by his box of old family photographs, on the very afternoon she had called to offer her condolences. Chapter 12. Fenn's Confession. That wasn't Inspector Drake, meanwhile, had pressed forward with his own line of inquiry regarding Tobias Fenn, and arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning in a state of some excitement, convinced that he had at last secured the breakthrough his investigation required. "He's admitted something, Miss Marple," he announced, settling into the chair she offered with the air of a man bringing important news. "Wouldn't say what at first, kept hedging about it, but I pressed him, and he finally came out with it. Seems he's been poaching rabbits off the Wraxham land for the better part of 2 years, selling them on quietly to the butcher in the next village, and he was afraid I'd find that out and add it to the case against him, so he's been less than forthcoming about exactly where he was and what he was doing in the hour or so before the body was found. Says he was actually down by the lower copse checking his snares, not at the punt at all, and didn't want to admit it for fear of the poaching charge." "How very understandable," said Miss Marple. "And does that change his alibi for the worse or for the better, in your estimation?" Drake frowned. "Bit of both, if I'm honest. It puts him further from the jetty at the relevant time, which is good for him in one sense, but it also means his original account was a lie, which doesn't exactly recommend him as a witness of unimpeachable character. I've half a mind to charge him with the poaching at least, since he's confessed to it outright, whatever comes of the murder business." "I shouldn't be too hasty about that, Inspector, if I were you," said Miss Marple. "A man who poaches rabbits to feed his family, or to supplement wages he considers unfairly low, is engaged in a very old and very ordinary sort of small dishonesty, the kind that has gone on in English villages for centuries, and will doubtless continue for centuries yet. It is not, I think, the same order of thing at all as the deliberate, calculated removal of a page from a dying woman's diary, or the burning of a photograph that might have revealed an inconvenient truth. I would not let one small confession distract you, Inspector, from the rather larger question of who had the most pressing reason to ensure that Lady Bantry never looked too closely at certain old family photographs, or remembered too clearly certain small physical details about the nephew she had only just discovered. Drake regarded her for a long moment, his earlier excitement visibly deflating into something more thoughtful. "You've been talking to old Ashworth," he said, not quite a question. "I have," said Miss Marple, "and I think, Inspector, that you might find it instructive to do the same, and then, perhaps, to send a cable to the authorities in Bulawayo, asking whether they have any record of a birthmark, of a particular sort, on a particular family, and whether the son of Edward Bantry is quite as definitively accounted for as Mr. Tully's documents would have us believe." Chapter 13. Miss Marple pours the tea. It was Miss Marple's own idea, and one she put into action with the particular gentle determination of a woman who has spent a great many years arranging small social occasions to serve purposes rather larger than they appeared, that a tea should be held at her own cottage. A quite ordinary, innocent gathering, ostensibly to thank the household at Wraxham Court for their patience during what had been, she said, a most distressing week for everyone concerned. She invited Rosamond Tate and Lawrence Tully and Phyllis Carow, and contrived, with a few well-placed words to Inspector Drake, to have him present as well, though in the guise of a family friend rather than an investigating officer, seated rather unobtrusively near the window with a cup of tea he did not particularly want. The conversation for the first half-hour ranged over nothing more significant than the weather, the prospects for the church fete the following year, and a long, comfortable digression on the part of Miss Marple regarding the proper cultivation of sweet peas, which she illustrated with such genuine enthusiasm that even Phyllis Carow, who had arrived looking pale and anxious, found herself relaxing by degrees into something like ordinary social ease. It was only when the second pot of tea had been poured that Miss Marple, with the air of a woman recollecting something of only passing interest, turned the conversation toward old Colonel Ashworth. "Such a remarkable memory he has, for a man of his age," she said, addressing the room in general but watching, from beneath her lowered eyelids, the precise effect of her words upon Lawrence Tully's face. "He was telling me only the other day about a New Year's gathering at the club in Bulawayo. Oh, more than 40 years ago now. He remembered a small boy there, your father's brother's son, Mr. Tully, as a matter of fact. Though, of course, that would have been long before your time." He recalled the most curious detail, a little reddish birthmark on the child's left arm just below the elbow, that the mother made quite a fuss over, claiming it ran 3 generations on her own side of the family. "I thought it such a charming little story. I wonder, Mr. Tully, whether you ever heard your own father speak of such a mark. It would be remarkable, would it not, if it had been passed down to you as well?" The room was very quiet for a moment. Rosamond glanced up, faintly puzzled by the apparent irrelevance of the question. Phyllis Carow had gone very still, her teacup halfway to her lips. Inspector Drake, by the window, did not move at all, though his eyes had sharpened considerably. Lawrence Tully laughed, a moment too late and a shade too loudly. "I'm afraid I've no such mark myself, Miss Marple. Perhaps it's skipped a generation. These family traits do, you know, from time to time." "How disappointing," said Miss Marple mildly. "I had so hoped to see it. I have always found family resemblances so very touching, the way small physical details carry forward across generations, long after the people who first bore them are gone. It must be quite difficult, I should think, to be the only one of a family left in England, with no one at all to confirm such small inherited details one way or the other." "It is, rather," said Tully, and reached for his own teacup with a hand that was not, Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction, entirely steady. "Though I don't see that it signifies a great deal, one way or the other. Birthmarks are hardly conclusive evidence of anything, are they?" "No, indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "Not on their own. It is only when one finds a number of small things together, a missing photograph, a missing diary page, a flower that does not grow where a man claims to have spent his childhood, a fire lit in June for no apparent reason, that one small absent birthmark begins to seem rather more significant than it might otherwise appear." She had not raised her voice at all, had not, indeed, changed her tone from the pleasant, unhurried register she had maintained throughout the entire conversation about sweet peas, and it was perhaps for that very reason that the effect of her words, falling into the quiet room, was so very much more devastating than any accusation shouted aloud could have been. Lawrence Tully set down his teacup with a small, precise click, and for just a moment, before he recovered himself, Miss Marple saw, quite clearly, the expression beneath the charm, watchful, calculating, and entirely without warmth. "I think," he said, very pleasantly, "that I had better be getting back to the house. There's a great deal still to arrange, with the funeral so close now." "Of course," said Miss Marple, rising to see him to the door with every appearance of ordinary courtesy. "I shan't keep you a moment longer, Mr. Tully. I'm sure you have a very great deal on your mind just now. Chapter 14. The Library at Dusk. It was, as it happened, Inspector Drake's own swift action, prompted by a conversation with Miss Marple, conducted in considerably more urgent terms once Lawrence Tully had departed the cottage, that brought matters to their resolution that same evening, though not in quite the manner either of them had anticipated. "I want a man watching that house tonight," Drake had said, already reaching for his hat. "If he's what you say he is, Miss Marple, and he knows now that we're onto something, he won't sit quiet and wait for the cable from Bulawayo to come back. A man who's built a whole new life on a forged identity doesn't simply hand himself over because an old lady asked him a clever question over tea." He had been right, though not entirely in the way he expected. It was not flight that Lawrence Tully attempted that evening, but something rather more desperate, a final, frantic search of the library at Wraxham Court for any remaining trace of evidence that might yet incriminate him, conducted in the failing light of dusk, while he believed the house otherwise occupied with preparations for dinner. It was Miss Marple herself, who had, with Rosamond's somewhat startled permission, returned to the house that evening on the pretext of having left her gloves behind at the tea, though in fact she had left nothing of the kind, who found him there, kneeling before the very picture frame that held the photograph of Lady Bantry's husband as a young man, his fingers working at the backing board with the blade of a small penknife. "I rather thought you might come back here, Mr. Tully," she said, from the doorway, in a voice that held no triumph at all, only a kind of tired sorrow. It was, after all, the one place in the house where you had spent so many hours sorting through old photographs, the one place where a man anxious to be rid of some final, damning piece of paper might think to hide it rather than destroy it outright, in case it should ever be needed again to support some future claim. Behind a photograph of the very man you were pretending to be descended from. How very fitting. Tully froze, the penknife still in his hand, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he set the knife down upon the table and drew out from behind the backing board a single folded sheet of paper, soft and slightly yellowed with handling, and held it out toward her, not, she understood, as a confession exactly, but as a man too exhausted by months of careful pretense to continue maintaining it any longer. "It's the missing page," he said quietly, "from her diary. I should have burned it with the photograph, that first night, but I couldn't quite bring myself to. She wrote," his voice caught unexpectedly, "on something that might have been genuine feeling. She wrote that she had begun to wonder whether I was truly Edward's grandson at all, or whether some clever fraud had been practiced upon her in her old age, and that she intended to write to Bulawayo herself, directly, rather than wait for me to produce further proof. She never once accused me outright. She only wondered, in her own hand, in her own private diary, whether she had been deceived, and asked herself whether she had the courage to find out the truth, even if it meant losing the only family she believed she had left." "And so you took the page," said Miss Marple, "and you took the photograph that might have shown her plainly that you bore none of the family's distinguishing marks. And when neither proved sufficient to settle your mind, you followed her down to the lake during the fête, when you knew she liked to walk alone among the roses before the crowds grew too thick. And you ensured that she would never write that letter to Bulawayo at all." "I didn't plan it," Tully said, and his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "I want you to understand that, at least. I went down to speak to her, to try, one more time, to convince her, to explain away the things she'd begun to doubt, and she wouldn't be convinced. She stood there on that jetty and told me, quite calmly, that she had always known, somewhere underneath, that something about me didn't quite fit, and that she had loved having a nephew so much that she had simply chosen, for a little while, not to look too closely. And then she said she could look no longer, and that she meant to write that letter that very evening, and I—" He stopped and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, and for a moment looked very young indeed and very frightened. "I only meant to stop her leaving. I put my hand on her arm, and she pulled away, too quickly, on that wet stone, and she fell, and struck her head, and went into the water, and I stood there, Miss Marple, for what felt like a very long time, and I did nothing at all to help her. That is the whole truth of it. I did not strike her, but I let her drown, when I might have pulled her out, because some small, terrible part of me understood, even as I stood there, exactly what her death would mean for everything I had built. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that held more sorrow in it than anger. "That, Mr. Tully," she said quietly, "is not so very different from murder, in the end, whatever name the law chooses to give it. Inspector Drake is waiting downstairs. I think you had better come with me now and tell him precisely what you have just told me." Chapter 15. What the diary truly said. The inquest, when it was finally held, took rather longer than Inspector Drake's earlier optimism had anticipated, complicated as it now was by the cable that had arrived from the authorities in Bulawayo only 2 days after Tully's confession, confirming, with the flat finality of an official record, that Edward Bantry's only son had in fact died of fever at the age of 19, unmarried and without issue, some 11 years before Lawrence Tully had ever presented himself at Wraxham Court bearing carefully forged letters and a memorized collection of second-hand family stories purchased, as it later emerged, from an elderly former farm clerk in Bulawayo who had known the real family slightly and had been only too glad to sell what fragments of memory he retained to a stranger with ready cash and an interest in disappeared colonial families. "He'd done his research thoroughly, I'll say that for him," Drake told Miss Marple, some days after the formal charges had been laid. "Spent the better part of 2 years building up the story before he ever wrote to her ladyship. Knew enough real detail to make it convincing. And counted, I should think, on the fact that an old woman with no other family of her own blood left alive would want very much to believe him, and would not look too hard for reasons to doubt. That is, I think, the saddest part of the whole affair," said Miss Marple. "Lady Bantry was not a foolish woman, Inspector. Quite the contrary. But loneliness makes us all a little less careful than we ought to be about the things we most wish were true. She wanted a family so very much that she allowed herself, for a year, not to look too closely at a young man who told her exactly what she longed to hear. It was only in these last weeks, I think, that something small and inconsistent, a turn of phrase, a gesture, perhaps simply a feeling she could not quite name, began to trouble her enough that she could no longer entirely silence her own doubts. She wrote them down, in the privacy of her own diary, because that was the one place she had always told herself the whole truth, even when she could not yet bring herself to say it aloud to another living soul. "And Tully read it," said Drake, "and panicked, and the rest we know well enough." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I confess I find it almost more troubling than if he had simply struck her down outright. There is something in his account, the standing there, doing nothing, while she drowned, having caused her fall but lacking, in that final moment, even the small courage required to undo what his own hand had set in motion, that strikes me as a particular kind of cowardice rather worse in its way than a single act of violence committed in anger. He did not mean to kill her, perhaps, but he meant, very much indeed, to let her die rather than risk the unravelling of his own deception, and the law, I think, will judge that distinction rather less significant than he would like it to be. Rosamond Tate, it transpired, had been concealing nothing more sinister than her own brief, foolish, romantic attachment to Tully himself, formed over the preceding year and never declared to anyone, which accounted for both her unexplained absence from the cake stall, a private, tearful conversation with him near the stables, in which she had begged him, without understanding why, to be honest with her about something she could not name but had sensed troubling him for weeks, and her evident distress upon his eventual arrest, a distress that had as much to do with wounded feeling as with any complicity in his crime. Phyllis Carrow, cleared entirely of any suspicion once her own account was confirmed by inquiries in Cape Town, returned there within the month, considerably wiser and rather more cautious about the company she kept on long sea voyages. The previous will, never superseded, was duly executed, and Wrexham Court passed, in the end, to a distant cousin in Hampshire, who had never met Lady Bantry above twice in his life, and showed every sign of selling the place within the year. Rosamond Tate, provided for under the old will's terms, took a small cottage in the village, and remained there, by all accounts a quieter and somewhat sadder woman than she had been, though not without a measure of peace. Chapter 16. The quiet return to Wexcombe. By the time the autumn leaves had begun to turn along the lane that ran past the churchyard, Wexcombe had settled, as villages generally do, back into its accustomed rhythms. The Fete Committee had already begun planning next year's event with a great deal of solemn discussion about whether the lake should, after all, be fenced off as a precaution, a question that occupied several lengthy meetings without ever quite reaching a conclusion, since half the village considered a fence an admission of disgrace, and the other half could not be persuaded that swans alone had ever drowned anybody. Miss Marple, walking home one crisp October afternoon from a visit to the lending library, found Inspector Drake waiting at her garden gate. His expression that of a man with something on his mind he was not entirely sure how to express. "I wanted to thank you properly, Miss Marple," he said, somewhat awkwardly, as she let them both in at the gate. "I'll admit I was slow to see what you saw from the very start. A fall on a wet stone is a simpler thing to write up than a man pretending to be someone he never was, and I'm afraid I reached for the simple explanation rather too readily, same as I generally do." "You are not alone in that, Inspector," said Miss Marple, leading the way up her garden path between beds of late asters and the last of the season's roses. "It is, I think, the most natural thing in the world to want the simplest explanation to be the true one, particularly when the alternative requires us to recognize that someone we have only just begun to trust has been deceiving us all along." Lady Bantry wanted very much to believe in her nephew, and so, for a good while, did the rest of the village, myself included, until the small inconsistencies grew too numerous to set aside any longer. It is rarely any one detail that gives such a person away, Inspector. It is the slow accumulation of many very small untruths, none of them individually damning, that together become impossible to ignore. "Like a flower that doesn't grow where a man says he was raised," said Drake, with the ghost of a smile. "Precisely so," said Miss Marple. "Or a missing photograph, or a birthmark that was never there to begin with. Any one of them, alone, might mean nothing at all. A poor memory, an unlucky coincidence, a simple absence with some entirely innocent explanation. It is only when one has the patience to notice a great many such small things, and the willingness to set them all down together, rather than dismissing each one separately as it arises, that the true shape of the matter begins, very gradually, to emerge." She paused beside the rose bed nearest her cottage door, where a single late bloom, slightly battered by the recent rains, still clung stubbornly to its stem, and looked out, for a moment, toward the church tower visible above the hedgerow, the same tower whose uncertain future had so preoccupied the vicar, and would, she suspected, continue to do so for a good many years yet, quite undisturbed by any of the small human dramas that had so recently convulsed the village around it. "It is a curious thing, Inspector," she said, "how very much trouble people will go to, in the end, simply to be loved by someone they have deceived. I find I cannot entirely hate Mr. Tully for what he did, dreadful as it was. I think, rather, that I am sorry for him, sorry that he wanted a family so very badly that he was prepared to invent one out of forged letters and borrowed memories, and sorrier still that when the truth finally came looking for him, he had not the courage to face it honestly, and so let an old woman drown, rather than admit, even to himself, what he truly was. "That's a more generous view of him than I can quite manage, I'll confess," said Drake. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, with a small, faintly rueful smile, turning back toward her cottage door as the first chill of the coming evening settled over the garden. "But then, Inspector, I have found, over a great many years of watching people in villages very like this one, that there is almost always something to be sorry for, in even the worst of us, though that, of course, is no reason whatsoever to let it go unpunished." The end.